Hello everyone, I'm here for your Thursday theme worship, and today's theme is bravery and courage. So we're going to light the candle. I light this candle to remind us that God is with us and that Jesus is the light of the world. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Now, I want you just to think about a time when you have been brave and had to show a lot of courage. Perhaps you've had to go into hospital, maybe you've had an operation, and maybe you had to show a lot of bravery then. Maybe you've been on stage and you were brave to stand up on stage and act or say something to the whole school. It might be you had to be brave when you went to the dentist, perhaps. I'm sure there are plenty of times when you can think back and thought, I had to be brave. And remember, you can still be scared, but brave at the same time. Sometimes people can end up being quite famous for an act of bravery. However, there are people being brave at this very moment all over the world that we possibly might never know about. So today's story that I'm going to read to you is set in World War II, and it's about a lady called Annie and her cat Charlie. It's called Saving Charlie. Annie Gregson had lived in the East End of London all her life. She had been born in the East End of London, where she'd gone to school in the East End of London, and where she had got married to Ernest. She had lived and worked in the East End of London. Annie had long since retired. She was 82 years old when the Second War broke out, and although her sister Joan had tried to persuade her to move down to Devon, Annie was determined to stay put, where she belonged, in the East End of London. Ernest had died some years ago, and Annie lived alone, just with her striped tabby cat Charlie for company. Annie loved Charlie. He was named after her favourite film star, Charlie Chaplin, and just like the famous actor, he walked with a lopsided limp, having been run over by a London bus. In truth, Charlie was a really clumsy, accident-prone animal. He had, in the end, his tail missing, where he got it trapped in the fishmonger's door when trying to escape with a fillet of haddock. He also had the tip of one ear missing. That was bitten off by a fight with a neighbour's bull terrier. If cats really did have 9 lives, then Charlie couldn't have many left. Early in 1939, when it became clear that Britain was under threat from German air raids, Anderson shelters were delivered to those houses who had enough space to put one in their gardens. Annie's garden was only small enough, and when she went to put the metal partitions being loaded from the wagon, she was not impressed. "How can I put that together?" she asked. "And what's the point of it anyway?" "It could save your life, missus," replied a blurry man with a grey moustache. "Get your neighbours to help put it up, and make sure you use it when the bombing starts." Bob Grant, Annie's next-door neighbour, helped to put the shelter together. Bob could not join the armed forces, as his eyesight was below standard, and so he was an air raid precaution warden. He dug out a rectangle for the shelter near the back of Annie's garden. Charlie jumped into the hole as soon as he saw it, and was nearly buried by a shovel of earth. The Blitz started in October 1940. The very first night the bombers came, Annie stayed in a house, listening in fear, as wave after wave of German planes released their bombs over the capital. 1 or 2 of the bombs were too close for comfort, and Annie's house shook as a huge explosion erupted nearby. Charlie was scared to death. He disappeared into a cupboard beneath the stairs and refused to come out until the following morning. When Annie eventually opened the front door, the air was thick with smoke. Sirens from fire engines and ambulances sounded, and the street was busy with people. Bob Grant was just returning home from duty. He looked exhausted and shocked by the events of the night. "It's a good job we sorted that shelter out for you, Annie," he said, stopping to talk to her. 3 houses in Bright Street were completely destroyed last night." Annie looked guilty. "I didn't use the shelter," she admitted. "I stayed in my living room." Bob shook his head in dismay. "You get yourself down there tonight," he warned, wagging a finger at the old lady. "The bombers will be back. You can be sure of that." Bob was right. The warning sirens sounded just after 9 o'clock, and this time Annie took his advice. Picking up the woolen shawl and a flask of tea, she called to Charlie in readiness to make her way down to the shelter. There was no sign of the cat. He had disappeared, and no matter how much she called his name, there was no response. Then there was a knock at her front door, and when she opened it, Bob Grant was there. "You need to go down to the shelter," he warned. "The bombers, they're on their way." A steady, monotonous drone in the distance told Annie that he was right. "I can't go without Charlie," she protested. "He'll be frightened on his own." "Charlie will be fine," insisted Bob, and he took hold of Annie's arm and led her through the house and down the garden to the Anderson shelter. "I'll come and check on you in a few hours' time," he said, and securing the door, he disappeared into the blackout. It was not long before the bombers arrived. London was taking another battering, and the explosion seemed even closer than before. Annie closed her eyes and covered her ears. She couldn't understand why humans were so cruel to each other. Why, oh why, did people never learn? Suddenly, a huge explosion ripped through the night. The ground shook, and a cascade of bricks and rubble pounded down onto the top of the Anderson shelter. Annie screamed in fright. There had been a direct hit nearby. Was it her house? Had her home been destroyed? And then there were voices, frantic, anxious voices, calling, shouting. The door to her shelter was wrenched open, and a bright light shone directly into her face. "Are you all right, Annie? Have you been hurt?" It was Bob Grant. He was inside the shelter, and he had an arm around Annie's shoulders. Another explosion bombed nearby. "I'm all right," said Annie, trembling. "My house? What about my house?" "It's still standing," said Bob, "but it's damaged. You can't go back in, Annie. It's too dangerous." Bill Hughes's house, 2 doors away, took a direct hit. In a sudden moment of realization, Annie's eyes were filled with tears. "What about Charlie?" she cried. "Charlie was inside." Bob didn't hesitate. "Look after her," he said to one of his colleagues. "I'll be back." The door had been blown out by the frame, and Annie's kitchen was covered in rubble. It was pitch black. Only once he was inside did Bob dare to use his torch, for the blackout regulations were still in force. As he clambered over the rubble in the kitchen, part of the ceiling collapsed around him in a cloud of dust. Coughing and spluttering, Bob continued his search. He was calling Charlie's name, but there was no sign of the animal. Bob would have to back out. It was too dangerous. As he turned to leave, a pathetic meowing noise stopped him in his tracks. It was there. He was sure it was there. But where was it coming from? Bob heard it again, and he followed the faint sound until he stopped by the cupboard beneath the stairs. There, cowering in the darkness, was the trembling cat, his eyes wide with fright. Bob picked up Charlie, unbuttoned his jacket, and cradled the cat in his warmth. A few minutes later, Bob Grant was taken back to the Anderson shelter. "Did you find him?" asked Anna anxiously. Bob unbuttoned his jacket and showed the head of one chewed ear as it popped out, looking round. "Charlie!" shouted Annie, the tears running down her face. "You're all right. You're all right." And then looking at Bob, who was smiling broadly, she said, "Thank you, Bob. Thank you so much." "That's the last life he's just used up," said Bob. "No more lives left for Charlie." Just want you to have a little think about all of the people that were actually showing an awful lot of courage in that short story there. I think there were quite a few characters. So as we finish our class worship, we'll just have a quiet prayer. So if you'd like to close your eyes or you want to put your head down, but just keep very still and quiet. Dear Lord, thank you for the brave men and women throughout history who have risked their lives to save others. Thank you for the small acts of courage and bravery that we often hear about. May we do all we can to learn from their example, and may we always be prepared to help those in need. Amen. Now, it might be in your bubble that you talk and you share some stories yourself when you've had to show bravery and courage in a difficult situation. So I'll leave you now to perhaps share some of those stories. And I hope you've had a good week and enjoy your weekend when that starts. And I'll look forward to seeing you all very soon. Bye bye.